So what I'm going to talk about today is focusing on just 2 or 3 key points between the house prices in Sydney and Melbourne and also Brisbane, and touch upon Adelaide and Canberra and Perth as well. There are many factors that we can look at while we analyze whether we think that the Melbourne house price market is currently undervalued. We can look at the reasons why it is likely to explode in coming years. And we could look at infrastructure, the government's massive infrastructure projects, stimulating the economy. We can look at migration coming back, the overseas students coming back after the very long lockdowns during COVID in Victoria. But on the negative side, we can see why the market's subdued because of the stamp duty savings disappearing, the state government taxes on property investors, including changing the land tax thresholds, especially for foreign investors, foreign investment taxes and land tax changes. So there's a lack of confidence at the time of this recording. So just to be clear, I'm recording this in the fourth quarter of 2024, so Q4 2024. So depending on when you watch this, you've got a link to this, so you could be watching it at any time. So just take that into context, that the figures I'm going to give you now, the data I'm going to give you now, is taken in Q4 2024. So that being said, let's have a look at a couple of key points without going too long into all the other factors, which you can read my report on my website. I'll have a link down below where you can read the full report on all the factors influencing the Melbourne market and why I think the Melbourne market is absolutely a buyer's market for the next 6 months to 12 months. I think there's really great pockets of opportunity in Melbourne. But I'm just going to give a couple of key reasons for that today and on my thinking here. And it's mainly in price differentials, both for houses and units. But let's look at houses. Let's look and study the house price differential between Sydney and Melbourne and see if that gives us some context of where the differential between Melbourne and Sydney should be, and is it really a large differential right now? So there are several different sources of Australian house price statistics and analysis, but I'm going to look at one of the most reliable, which is CoreLogic, but I'm not just going to rely on CoreLogic's data for house prices. I'm also going to cross-check that with the official government statistics from the Australian Bureau of Statistics. Now, both of those data sets, CoreLogic, very reliable. Many analysts and real estate agents use the CoreLogic data. I would say most of them use CoreLogic. And the Australian Bureau of Statistics tends to lag and the data comes out a lot more slowly, but it's also they're both based on transaction prices. So if we look right now at the Sydney established house price according to CoreLogic as of June 2024, the end of the financial year, we can see that the Sydney house price is 1.188 million. Cross-checking that against the Australian Bureau of Statistics, let me just call it the ABS going forward, we can see that the figure is 1.4 million. The third figure that I often use is based on asking prices. So asking prices can be very different from transaction prices. For example, I can be asking $2 million for my house, but I'm going to sell it at 1.5 million. So CoreLogic in the Australian Bureau of Statistics will record the 1.5 million or variations thereof, depending on how much data they put in, whether they cut out the top 10% or the bottom 10% and use the average or the median. So it's more complicated than that. But just using their figures, which they have tons of their people putting this data together, so we don't have to look into that. But why I like the SQM figures too is because that is also a little bit of a confidence barometer. It can show whether people are confident in asking more, or it can show are they unrealistic and asking more. So if we look at the SQM figures right now, we can see the asking figure for Sydney is 1.9 million and the asking price for Melbourne houses is 1.2 million. So the differential between those two in asking prices sits currently at 35%. In other words, the asking price for Sydney houses is sitting at 35% more expensive than Melbourne. In the Australian Bureau of Statistics figures, which is actual transactions, we can see that the price difference between Sydney and Melbourne, in other words, Sydney houses in actual transactions, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, are currently at 41%. So 35% for SQM, 41% for the Australian Bureau of Statistics, and CoreLogic's differential shows that Sydney is 53% more expensive. So it ranges between 35% and 53%. Okay, going back 10 years. So I want to see what the 10 years ago, and I want to see what the difference was 15 years ago compared to today. Now, statistics, you can say what you want about statistics, and it depends the starting point, the end point, the data set that you use, but we have to have some basis for comparison. So bear with me and let me use those figures. What's the famous quote about statistics? It is lies, damned lies and statistics. That's the one. Whether that's Disraeli or Mark Twain, I'm not sure who said that. Depends on where you look it up. So let's go back 10 years. That being said, let's go back 10 years. And I've just used the Australian Bureau of Statistics here for the moment for houses. So going back 10 years ago, there was a 37% difference between Sydney and Melbourne house prices. Sydney was 37% more expensive. And on today's figures, Sydney is, according to the Australian Statistics, 41% higher. Okay, so this is important to sort of get our heads around here. Go back 10 years, what we see is that there was a 37% difference between Sydney and Melbourne. So I'm always quoting these figures as in Sydney being the more expensive city by what percent. So 37% 10 years ago, today 53% according to CoreLogic's data. So we would have to think then that there's a potential for a 16% catch up for Melbourne to get back to the 10-year-old differential. But if we go back 15 years, that's really interesting. There was a 23% difference, not a 53% difference. So again, a potential for, nearly a catch up there. If we go back 20 years, there was an incredible 85% difference in house price between Sydney and Melbourne. Hard to believe, but in the Australian Bureau of Statistics figures at that time, Sydney house prices were 515,000, Melbourne 278,000. So it's an 85% differential between Melbourne. So what that tells me is that there is a good potential, even if Sydney doesn't move for the next 2, 3, 4 years, a good potential catch up in prices. But on the other side of the equation, let's look quickly at some of the other cities. So this is also what I think is quite important. So again, using CoreLogic's data, Brisbane house prices have now overtaken Melbourne. According to CoreLogic, Brisbane house prices are averaging to 881,000. That's a 13% higher figure than the Melbourne figure at 777,000. So Brisbane has finally overtaken Melbourne in house price growth. So it's, to me, Melbourne should be more expensive. It should be Sydney, should be Melbourne, should be Brisbane, in that order. And that's based on population, economy. We should also look at it, because to make my argument more logical, we could argue that if there's a population of 100,000 people in a certain city and they're all billionaires, obviously house prices are going to be a ridiculous analogy, but just to show my point, house prices are going to be crazily high. But if there's a population of 10 million, they all live in poverty, house prices are going to be incredibly low. Of course, everybody understands that makes sense. So let's quickly look at the income differential between the state of Victoria and Queensland, or the cities of Melbourne and Brisbane. So according to a report in September 2024 by PayScale, which analysed 49,000 employers, the average salary in Melbourne was 78,000. The average salary in Brisbane was 76,000, so no difference. And just for those who are interested, the average salary in Sydney was 82,000, a little bit higher. So does that justify this price difference in houses? So in other words, Brisbane house prices have eclipsed, according to CoreLogic's figures, have overtaken Melbourne, yet the salaries are the same. And yet Melbourne's population is 4.3 million and Brisbane's population is 2.2 million. So incomes are the same, population's double in Melbourne, nearly double. I don't think it can justify Brisbane house overtaking Melbourne. I think that's for maybe the first or second time in history. If we also look at CoreLogic's house prices, you can see it on my report, actual figures from CoreLogic on the website link down below. We can see that not only Brisbane has overtaken Melbourne house prices, but has Adelaide, so has Canberra, maybe we'd expect Canberra, and so has Perth. So we have Perth, Adelaide, Brisbane, all in the last 12 months, as they've had good growth, overtaking Melbourne house price. So that's all I wanted to sort of talk about in this video. So let's talk about units and apartments. A couple of things I just want to mention there. If we take the capital city average of all 8 capital cities, we can see that Melbourne units or apartments are currently 16% below capital city average. And if we look at the difference between Sydney and Melbourne, Sydney units are 37% higher currently than Melbourne, and Brisbane units are 9% higher. So not sure about that 9% in Brisbane, because Brisbane has a lot of old and very, very affordable apartments. Melbourne has a lot more stock of newer apartments, which can push the value up. But what I have seen in the last couple of weeks is I've had 3 separate phone calls from 3 real estate agents I know operating in the Brisbane area. One is only in new property and the other 2 are in secondary sales. And all 3 agents rang me. They don't know each other as far as I know, maybe they do, but they rang me independently to have a chat about what I thought about the Melbourne unit market and prices. And when I told them the prices of secondary sale unit markets of buildings that were sort of 3 to 7 year old, and I'm not talking here the cookie cutter buildings, the massive high rise where there's hundreds and hundreds of 1-bedroom apartments, for example. I was talking about decent buildings close into the city, more scarcity factor, not those massive high rise towers, where you can buy a 1-bedroom apartment from $350,000 to $430,000, and they were saying that the equivalent apartments in Brisbane were probably 600 plus, certainly 500,000 plus, and 2 bedrooms were 700 to 800,000. Again, Melbourne representing way better value. So they were looking. 2 of the agents were looking for themselves to invest in a small 1-bedroom in Melbourne, where you can get a 5 or a 6% rent return at a significant discount to the Brisbane unit market price, and yet they are selling properties in Brisbane. The other agent specializes in brand new properties, and he was saying that brand new 2-bedroom apartments are pushing $1 million. 1-bedroom brand new is 650, 700 in good projects, in good developments, certainly 600 plus for those 1-bedrooms. So incredible figures in Brisbane there compared to Melbourne. So there are really tremendous, I think, bargains, but you've got to buy very carefully. So you definitely need a buyer's agent to help you if you're buying in the Melbourne apartment market. You can pick up brand new apartments at a reasonable price. You can certainly pick up secondary sale markets at incredible bargains, and that will probably last for at least the next 6 months. It's absolutely a buyer's market in the apartment market in Melbourne. But of course, you have to have patience. So read my report down below. If you need me to help source your property, that's what I do. I help many, many people do that. Happy to chat to you. Just arrange a call and we can discuss your particular requirements. So just to finish off, just want to talk about rents. So what we can see is the capital city average rent for all units is $629. So the average of those 8 capital cities in Australia is currently $629 a week. And this is as of when I'm recording this, which is, as I mentioned, the last quarter of 2024. Sydney, we're looking at $696 per week, and Brisbane at $578 per week. Now, I showed earlier in this video that the incomes between Sydney, Melbourne, and Brisbane on the average are pretty much the same. So the incomes for the same jobs are pretty much the same throughout Australia. That doesn't change, but the rents are significantly cheaper currently for units in Melbourne at $549 compared to Sydney at $696 per week. National capital average $629 per week. And Brisbane is 578 and Melbourne is 549. A lot of little figures there, but what that shows me is that there's still room for growth in the Melbourne unit market. And with prices deflated, rental growth potential, a good safe bet. If you can't afford to invest in a house, we do love buying townhouses and houses for our clients because they have the land value. But if you do want to lock into the property market, that for a good long-term investment, Melbourne for the next 6 months is absolutely the place to pick up a bargain. So feel free to read my report or schedule a call for a personal discussion. Thanks so much.